Sarah Martinez had always believed that the worst thing that could happen to her was losing her job at the downtown accounting firm. She was wrong. Dead wrong. At 28 years old, she thought she understood danger, thought she knew what fear felt like when her ex-boyfriend Jake would show up drunk at her apartment, banging on the door and screaming her name. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Standing in the parking lot of Miller's convenience store at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October, staring down the barrel of a gun held by a man whose hands shook with desperation. The evening had started like any other. Sarah had worked late again, trying to finish the quarterly reports that her boss, Mr. Henderson, insisted needed to be completed by Wednesday morning. The office building had emptied hours ago, leaving only the security guard downstairs and the cleaning crew that moved through the floors like ghosts. She had finally saved her work, shut down her computer, and gathered her things around 11:30 p.m. The parking garage was nearly empty, her red Honda Civic sitting alone under the flickering fluorescent lights. As she drove through the quiet streets toward her apartment, Sarah noticed she was running low on gas. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and she remembered that she had meant to fill up that morning but had rushed to work instead after oversleeping. She spotted Miller's convenience store on the corner of 5th and Maple, its bright lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The place looked safe enough, with security cameras visible and decent lighting around the gas pumps. Sarah pulled up to pump number 3 and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the main road and the occasional sound of a car passing by. She stepped out of her car, the cool October air hitting her face and making her pull her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The temperature had dropped significantly since the afternoon, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. Inside the store, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow. Sarah waved at him through the window and began the process of filling her tank. The gas pump clicked and hummed as fuel flowed into her car, and she found herself checking her phone, scrolling through missed messages from her sister Lisa, who was always worried about her working so late. That was when she first noticed him. A man in his early 30s, tall and lean with dark hair that looked like he had been running his hands through it, emerged from behind the store. He moved with quick, nervous steps, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to follow him. Sarah glanced at him briefly, noting the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame and how his eyes darted around the parking lot. Something about his behavior made her uncomfortable, but she told herself she was being paranoid. Living alone in the city had made her overly cautious about strangers. The man approached the store entrance, paused for a moment, then walked back toward the side of the building. Sarah watched him out of the corner of her eye while pretending to focus on her phone. He repeated this pattern twice more, walking toward the store, stopping, then retreating. His movements were erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly agitated. Marcus Thompson had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. His stomach cramped with hunger, and his hands shook not just from the cold night air but from the withdrawal symptoms that had been plaguing him for weeks. The last of his money had gone to his dealer 2 days ago, and now he was faced with a choice that his former self would have found unthinkable. He needed cash, and he needed it fast. The convenience store sat there like an answer to his prayers, albeit a terrifying one. He had been circling the building for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. Marcus had never committed a serious crime in his life. Sure, he had shoplifted candy as a kid and had been arrested once for possession, but armed robbery was a different beast entirely. The gun in his jacket pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. The weapon belonged to his roommate Tommy, who had left it behind when he moved out last month. Marcus had found it while cleaning out the apartment, wrapped in a dirty towel and shoved in the back of a closet. He had stared at it for hours, knowing that it represented a line he had never imagined crossing. But desperation had a way of rewriting a person's moral code, and Marcus was nothing if not desperate. Sarah finished pumping gas and replaced the nozzle in its holder. She screwed the cap back onto her tank and was about to get back into her car when she noticed the man was now standing near the store entrance, his hand inside his jacket. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, made every alarm bell in her head start ringing. She had taken a self-defense class 6 months ago after a string of attacks on women in her neighborhood, and her instructor had emphasized the importance of trusting her instincts. She decided to wait in her car for a few minutes, see what the man would do. Sarah climbed into the driver's seat, but left the door unlocked and the keys in the ignition. Through her windshield, she watched as the man finally worked up the courage to enter the store. The automatic door slid open with a soft whoosh, and he disappeared inside. Marcus stepped into the bright interior of Miller's convenience store, immediately overwhelmed by the warmth and the smell of coffee and hot dogs from the roller grill. The clerk, whose name tag read Bill, looked up from his newspaper with a friendly smile. "Evening," Bill said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Cold one tonight, isn't it?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. He walked slowly down one of the aisles, pretending to browse while his heart hammered against his ribs. The store was small, with only 3 narrow aisles and a refrigerated section along the back wall. Security cameras were mounted in each corner, their red lights blinking like mechanical eyes. Marcus knew that what he was about to do would be recorded, that his face would be captured and probably broadcast on the evening news. But he also knew that if he didn't do something soon, he would be dead within a week. He picked up a pack of gum, turned it over in his hands, then set it back down. His palms were sweating despite the cold, and he wiped them on his jeans. The gun felt heavier with each passing second, its weight pulling down the entire right side of his body. "You finding everything okay?" Bill asked, looking over the top of his glasses. "Yeah, just looking," Marcus managed to say, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah watched through the store windows as the man moved through the aisles. Something was definitely wrong with him. His movements were too deliberate, too controlled, like someone fighting against their own instincts. She had seen this kind of behavior before, in the emergency room where she had volunteered during college. People on drugs often move this way, caught between their rational mind and their chemical needs. She was reaching for her phone to call the police when she saw the man pull something from his jacket. Even through the store windows and from her position in the parking lot, she could see that it was a gun. The clerk behind the counter couldn't see it yet, his view blocked by the height of the shelves. But Sarah had a clear line of sight. Time seemed to slow down as she watched the scene unfold. The man approached the counter, the weapon now clearly visible in his right hand. The clerk looked up, saw the gun, and his face went white. Sarah could see his mouth moving, probably asking the robber what he wanted, but she couldn't hear the words through the glass. Marcus raised the gun with trembling hands, pointing it at Bill's chest. The older man immediately raised his hands, his newspaper falling to the floor behind the counter. "Please," Bill said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Just tell me what you need. I've got a family, man. 2 grandkids." "The money," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "All of it. From the register." Bill nodded quickly and turned toward the cash register. His movements were slow and deliberate, clearly trying not to spook the armed man in front of him. The register opened with a mechanical ding, revealing several bills and a handful of coins. "There's not much here," Bill said apologetically. "Maybe $60, $70. It's been a slow night." Marcus felt his heart sink. $60 would barely buy him enough drugs to get through the next day, let alone solve his larger problems. His debt to his dealer was approaching $500, and the threats were becoming more specific, more violent. The man had made it clear that Marcus had until Friday to come up with the money, or there would be consequences. "There's got to be more," Marcus said, waving the gun toward the back of the store. "A safe or something." "I don't have access to any safe," Bill replied honestly. "I'm just the night clerk. The manager comes in tomorrow morning with the combination." Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of calling the police and waiting for them to arrive, she quietly opened her car door and stepped out into the night. She had no plan, no clear idea of what she intended to do, but she couldn't sit there and watch an innocent man get hurt or killed over what was probably less than $100. She approached the store carefully, staying low and using the parked cars as cover. The automatic doors were motion activated, and she knew that if she got too close, they would open and announce her presence. But there was a side window that gave her a better view of what was happening inside, and she crept toward it. Through the glass, she could see the robber becoming increasingly agitated. His free hand was running through his hair, and he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. The gun wavered in his grip, sometimes pointing at the clerk, sometimes at the ceiling, sometimes at the floor. Sarah realized that this inconsistency made him even more dangerous. An experienced criminal might be cruel, but they would be predictable. This man was clearly an amateur, which meant anything could happen. Marcus felt the situation spiraling out of control. The small amount of money in the register wasn't going to solve his problems, and staying in the store much longer would only increase the chances of someone calling the police. But leaving empty-handed meant facing his dealer with nothing to show for his desperation. "Look," he said to Bill, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know you probably have more money somewhere. Maybe you skimmed some earlier, put it aside. I'm not judging you, man, but I really need you to think about where else there might be cash." Bill shook his head slowly. "Son, I've been working retail for 35 years. I don't steal from my employers, and I don't keep personal money at work. What you see is what you get." The honesty in the older man's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus felt a wave of despair wash over him. This had been his plan, his solution, and it was falling apart in real time. He had risked everything for nothing. That was when he heard the soft whoosh of the automatic doors opening behind him. Marcus spun around, gun raised, and found himself face to face with a young woman in business clothes. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and brown eyes that showed no fear, only determination. She held her hands slightly away from her body, palms visible, in a gesture that was both non-threatening and confident. "Don't," she said simply, her voice calm and clear. Sarah had acted on pure instinct, walking through the doors before her rational mind could talk her out of it. Now, standing 10 feet away from an armed man, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The self-defense class had taught her that the most important weapon in any dangerous situation was her mind, and right now, her mind was working overtime. She could see that the robber was young, probably not much older than she was. His clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, his face was gaunt, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Most importantly, his grip on the gun was all wrong. He held it like someone who had seen weapons in movies but had never actually fired one. "You need to leave," Marcus said, trying to sound threatening but failing to hide the panic in his voice. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," Sarah replied, taking a small step forward. "See, I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking that this was supposed to be simple. Walk in, get the money, walk out. But it's not simple, is it?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard by her calm tone. "What are you talking about?" "You're shaking," Sarah observed. "Your hands, your voice, probably your knees too. That's adrenaline, and it's making you sloppy. Look at how you're holding that gun. Your fingers on the trigger, but your grip is too high. If that thing goes off by accident, you could hit any one of us, including yourself." Behind the counter, Bill watched the exchange with growing amazement. The young woman seemed to know exactly what she was doing, speaking to the robber like a therapist rather than a victim. "I can see you don't really want to hurt anyone," Sarah continued, taking another small step forward. "The way you keep looking at Mr." She glanced at the clerk's name tag, at Bill. "You're not seeing a target, you're seeing a person. Someone's grandfather. That's good. That means you're not too far gone." Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, and he angrily wiped them away with his free hand. "You don't know anything about me," he said. "I know you're hungry," Sarah said. "I know you're sick, probably withdrawing from something. I know you're scared, and I know this isn't who you used to be. But here's what I also know. Whatever you think this is going to solve, it won't. Even if you get away with the money, even if nobody gets hurt, this won't fix the real problem." Marcus lowered the gun slightly, his arm growing tired from holding it extended. "Then, what am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I owe people money. Bad people. If I don't pay them by Friday." "There are other options," Sarah said firmly. "There are always other options. But first, you need to put that gun down." For a moment, the store was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerators and the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights. Marcus stared at the young woman who had somehow appeared in his life at its lowest point, offering him something he had thought was gone forever, hope. Then, he heard the sirens in the distance, growing closer by the second, and realized that someone had already called the police. The brief moment of possibility shattered like glass, replaced by the cold reality of his situation. He was holding a gun in a convenience store with 2 witnesses, and the authorities were on their way. Marcus raised the weapon again, this time pointing it directly at Sarah's head from less than 6 feet away. "Nobody move," he said, his voice now hard with desperation. "Nobody move, or I swear I'll pull this trigger." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something that changed everything. He meant it. The brief connection they had shared was gone, replaced by the cornered animal panic of someone who had run out of choices. The sound of approaching sirens had triggered something primal in him, and she realized that the next few seconds would determine whether everyone in that store lived or died. The gun was now pointed directly at her forehead, and Marcus's finger was tightening on the trigger. Sarah could see the exact moment when he made the decision to fire, could see it in the way his jaw clenched and his eyes hardened. She had perhaps 2 seconds before he would squeeze that trigger and end her life. But Sarah Martinez had not survived 28 years in an increasingly dangerous world without learning a few things about survival. And she was about to show Marcus Thompson that pressing a gun to her head was the biggest mistake he would ever make. Sarah's reaction was instant and decisive, born from hours of training that had become muscle memory. As Marcus tightened his finger on the trigger, she twisted her body to the left while simultaneously bringing her right hand up in a sharp arc. Her palm struck the underside of his wrist with enough force to send the gun pointing toward the ceiling just as it discharged. The sound of the gunshot in the confined space was deafening, like a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very walls of the small store. The bullet embedded itself in the acoustic tile above, sending down a shower of white fragments and dust. Marcus stumbled backward, shocked by the sudden movement and the noise, his ears ringing from the gunshot. Sarah didn't give him time to recover. She followed through on her defensive movement, grabbing his gun arm with both hands and driving her knee upward toward his elbow. The impact sent a shock of pain through Marcus's arm, and his fingers involuntarily released their grip on the weapon. The gun clattered across the linoleum floor, spinning until it came to rest against a display of motor oil near the front window. Marcus stared at it for a split second, his mind trying to process what had just happened before lunging forward to retrieve it. But Sarah was already moving, stepping between him and the weapon while Bill, finally, snapping out of his shock paralysis, grabbed the phone behind the counter to call for help. "The gun is down. The gun is down," Bill shouted into the phone, though Sarah could hear that sirens were already very close, probably just a few blocks away. Marcus reached Sarah just as she bent to pick up the weapon, and they collided in a tangle of arms and legs. He was taller and probably outweighed her by 30 pounds, but desperation gave him strength while training gave her technique. They hit the floor hard, Marcus on top, both of them grappling for control of the gun. Sarah had learned in her self-defense class that ground fighting was often where women were at the greatest disadvantage due to weight and strength differences, but her instructor had also taught her that technique could overcome raw power if applied correctly. She wrapped her legs around Marcus's waist in what her trainer had called a guard position, using her leverage to prevent him from pinning her completely while keeping him from easily reaching the gun. "Let me have it," Marcus gasped, stretching one arm toward the weapon while using the other to try to push Sarah's hands away from his face. "You don't understand what they'll do to me." "I understand more than you think," Sarah replied through gritted teeth, using her forearms to block his attempts to strike her. "But killing people won't save you." The physical struggle was intense, but brief. Marcus, weakened by days without proper food and suffering from withdrawal symptoms, couldn't maintain his initial burst of desperate strength. Sarah, meanwhile, was in good physical condition from her gym membership and had the advantage of a clear head. She managed to roll him off of her and scrambled toward the gun, reaching it just as the convenience store doors burst open. "Police! Everyone get down!" 3 officers entered with weapons drawn, their voices overlapping as they shouted commands at everyone in the store. Sarah immediately dropped flat to the floor, her hands clearly visible, the gun sliding away from her across the smooth surface. Marcus, seeing the officers and realizing his situation was hopeless, simply sat where he had fallen and raised his hands. "Don't shoot," he called out. "I'm not armed. The gun is over there." Officer Janet Rodriguez was the first to reach the weapon, quickly securing it while her partners moved to handcuff Marcus. She was a 12-year veteran of the force who had responded to dozens of armed robbery calls, but something about this scene didn't match the usual pattern. "Who fired the weapon?" she asked, looking between Sarah and Marcus. "He did," Sarah said, slowly sitting up with her hands still visible. "It went into the ceiling when I disarmed him." Rodriguez looked up and saw the fresh hole in the acoustic tile, white dust still drifting down like snow. She turned her attention to Bill, who was leaning heavily against the counter behind the cash register. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" No, I'm okay," Bill said, though his hands were shaking as he tried to light a cigarette with trembling fingers. "That young lady saved my life. Maybe all our lives." Officer Michael Chun was finishing the process of handcuffing Marcus when he looked over at Sarah with curiosity. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to step outside so we can sort this out. Are you a security guard?" "Off-duty police. I'm an accountant," Sarah said simply, which drew surprised looks from all three officers. As they moved outside into the parking lot, Sarah could see that the initial 3 patrol cars had been joined by several others, their red and blue lights painting the entire area in alternating colors. An ambulance had also arrived, and paramedics were checking Marcus for injuries while he sat in the back of one of the police cars. Detective Lisa Park arrived 15 minutes later, just as Sarah was finishing her initial statement to Officer Rodriguez. Park was a 20-year veteran who specialized in violent crimes, and she had seen enough armed robberies to know that this situation was highly unusual. "Ms. Martinez," Detective Park said, sitting across from Sarah in the back of an unmarked car. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened in there. Take your time." Sarah recounted the events in detail, from noticing Marcus's suspicious behavior in the parking lot to the moment when the police arrived. Detective Park took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "You said you took a self-defense class. When was this?" "About 6 months ago," Sarah replied. "It was a 10-week course at the community center. The instructor was a former Marine named Carlos Mendez. And this instructor taught you the specific techniques you used to disarm Mr. Thompson?" Sarah nodded. "He said that in a close-range situation with a handgun, the most important thing is to get offline from the barrel and control the weapon hand. He made us practice the same movements hundreds of times until they became automatic." Detective Park made a note of the instructor's name, already planning to verify Sarah's story. Not that she doubted it. The physical evidence clearly supported Sarah's account, but thoroughness was important in cases like this. "Ms. Martinez, I have to ask, why did you enter the store? Most people would have called 911 and waited for us to arrive." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "I saw him pull the gun, and I could see the clerk behind the counter. The man looked scared, desperate. People do unpredictable things when they're desperate. I was afraid that if I waited for the police, someone would be dead by the time you got there." "That was incredibly brave," Detective Park said. "It was also incredibly dangerous. You could have been killed." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "But I couldn't just sit in my car and watch." While Sarah gave her statement, Marcus was being processed at the precinct. The gun, which proved to be unregistered and reported stolen from a home burglary 3 months earlier, was being held as evidence. Marcus's fingerprints were all over it, and the security camera footage from the store clearly showed him threatening the clerk and firing the weapon. Detective Park interviewed Marcus separately, and what she learned painted a picture that was both tragic and all too common. Marcus Thompson had been a college graduate with a degree in computer science and a promising career at a tech startup. But a back injury from a car accident had led to prescription painkillers, which had led to harder drugs when the prescription ran out, which had led to losing his job, then his apartment, then his relationship with his family. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone," Marcus insisted during his interview. "I just needed enough money to get clean, to get back on my feet." "You pointed a loaded weapon at 2 innocent people," Detective Park replied. "You fired that weapon in a confined space. Whether you intended to hurt anyone or not, your actions put lives at risk." Marcus broke down during the interview, the weight of what he had done finally hitting him. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross, had become exactly the kind of person he used to fear. The drugs had stolen more than just his health and his career. They had stolen his sense of who he was. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with her own emotional aftermath. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to wear off, leaving her shaky and nauseated. Officer Rodriguez noticed her hands trembling and suggested she allow the paramedics to check her over. "I'm fine," Sarah said. "Just a little overwhelmed, I think." "That's perfectly normal," Rodriguez assured her. "You've been through a traumatic experience. Even trained officers sometimes have delayed reactions to situations like this." The paramedic who examined Sarah confirmed that she had no physical injuries, but he recommended that she follow up with her doctor in the next day or 2. He also gave her information about counseling services available to crime victims, explaining that many people found it helpful to talk to someone after experiencing violence. By the time Sarah was released from the scene, it was nearly 2 a.m. The convenience store had been cordoned off with yellow tape while crime scene technicians processed the evidence, and Bill had been sent home after giving his statement. Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Lisa. "Saw the news. Are you okay? Call me." Sarah realized that the story was probably already making its way onto the local news websites. A convenience store robbery that ended with a civilian disarming the perpetrator was exactly the kind of story that local media loved. She dreaded the attention that would likely follow, but she also knew that there was no avoiding it now. She drove home slowly, her hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Her apartment building looked exactly the same as when she had left it that morning, but somehow everything felt different now. She had left as Sarah Martinez, mild-mannered accountant, and returned as Sarah Martinez, the woman who had disarmed a gunman. Her phone rang as she was unlocking her apartment door. The caller ID showed her sister's number. Sarah, thank God. I saw on the news that there was a robbery at Miller's convenience store. Someone said a customer was involved. I was so scared it was you. It was me, Sarah said quietly, settling onto her couch with the phone pressed to her ear. What do you mean it was you? You were a customer there. I was getting gas. I saw what was happening, and Sarah paused, struggling to find the right words. I stopped it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Lisa spoke again. You stopped it? Sarah, what are you talking about? Sarah spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything to her sister, who alternated between being proud of her bravery and terrified by the risks she had taken. By the time she hung up, Sarah was emotionally exhausted. She knew she should try to get some sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she could see Marcus pointing the gun at her head, could hear the deafening crack of the gunshot. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Marcus Thompson was spending his first night in jail, probably wondering how his life had spiraled so completely out of control. Somewhere else, Bill was trying to explain to his wife why he was home 3 hours early and why his clothes smelled like gunpowder. Sarah thought about the moment when she had looked into Marcus's eyes and seen him make the decision to kill her. She had been perhaps 2 seconds away from death, saved only by her training and her willingness to act. The magnitude of that realization was almost overwhelming. But she also thought about the conversation they had shared before the sirens arrived, about the brief connection she had felt with him when he talked about his debts and his fears. He wasn't a monster, despite what he had done. He was a person who had made a series of bad choices that had led him to an unthinkable place. That didn't excuse his actions, but it did make them more understandable. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. Ms. Martinez? This is Rebecca Chun from Channel 7 News. I understand you were involved in stopping an armed robbery tonight. I was wondering if you'd be willing to do an interview about your experience. I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in doing any interviews right now, Sarah said politely but firmly. I understand this is a difficult time, but our viewers would really like to hear your story. You're being called a hero. I'm not a hero, Sarah said. I'm just someone who did what felt right in the moment. Thank you for calling, but I really need to go. She hung up and immediately turned off her phone. She had a feeling that the next few days were going to be very complicated, and she wanted at least one night to process everything before the outside world came knocking. As she finally prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning. Same brown eyes, same dark hair, same face that she had been looking at for 28 years. But something fundamental had changed. She had discovered something about herself tonight, something about her capacity for action in extreme circumstances. Most people went their entire lives without ever being tested the way she had been tested tonight. Most people never found out whether they would run toward danger or away from it, whether they would act or freeze when someone else's life was on the line. Sarah now knew the answer to those questions about herself, and that knowledge would change how she saw herself forever. She also knew that her actions tonight would have consequences far beyond what she could currently imagine. Marcus Thompson's life would never be the same, obviously, but neither would hers. The woman who had walked into Miller's convenience store as a customer would emerge as something else entirely, though she wasn't yet sure what that something would be. As she lay in bed, trying unsuccessfully to fall asleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had been just the beginning of something much larger. She had stepped across a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, had revealed herself to be someone capable of extraordinary action under pressure. That revelation would bring opportunities and dangers that she couldn't yet foresee. But it would also bring responsibility. Whether she wanted it or not, Sarah Martinez was about to become a very public figure, and how she handled that attention would determine not just her own future, but possibly the futures of others who might find themselves in similar situations. The clock on her nightstand read 4:17 a.m. when she finally drifted off to sleep, and her dreams were filled with the sound of gunshots and the weight of choices that could never be undone. Sarah woke up 6 hours later to the sound of her doorbell ringing insistently. She stumbled out of bed, her body aching from the previous night's struggle, and peered through the peephole to see a young woman with a microphone standing next to a man with a video camera. Behind them, she could see at least 2 news vans parked on the street in front of her building. She backed away from the door without answering, her heart racing. Somehow, despite her refusal to give interviews the night before, the media had found her address. Her phone, which she had turned off before going to bed, showed 17 missed calls and 43 unread text messages when she powered it back on. The first call was from her boss, Mr. Henderson, who sounded both concerned and slightly annoyed. "Sarah, I'm seeing your name all over the news this morning. I need you to call me back immediately so we can discuss how this might affect the firm." The next several messages were from reporters, friends she hadn't spoken to in months, and even a few people claiming to be talent agents interested in exploring opportunities with her. But the one that made her stomach drop was from an unknown number with a simple text. "Saw you on the news. We need to talk." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. There was only one person who would sign a text with just the letter D, and she had hoped never to hear from him again. David Reeves had been her boyfriend 3 years ago, a relationship that had ended badly when she discovered he was involved in some kind of illegal business that he had never fully explained. She had broken up with him immediately, moved to a new apartment, and changed her phone number. The fact that he was contacting her now, after she had become a news story, filled her with dread. The doorbell rang again, followed by a knock and a woman's voice calling. "Ms. Martinez? This is Jessica Walsh from the Morning News. We just want to ask you a few questions about last night." Sarah retreated to her bedroom and called her sister Lisa, who answered on the first ring. "Sarah, I've been watching the news all morning. You're everywhere. Channel 3 is calling you the convenience store hero, and Channel 7 has a whole segment about civilian self-defense. Are you okay?" "No, I'm not okay," Sarah said, collapsing onto her bed. "There are reporters outside my apartment, my boss is freaking out, and I just got a text from David." "David? Your ex-boyfriend David? The sketchy one?" "That's the one. He says we need to talk, and you know that's never good." Lisa was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, maybe you should come stay with me for a few days. Let this media circus die down a little bit." "I can't hide forever," Sarah replied. "And I have to work tomorrow. Mr. Henderson is already upset about the publicity." "What's wrong with publicity? You saved someone's life." "Some companies don't like their employees making headlines," Sarah explained. "It can be seen as unprofessional or disruptive to business." What Sarah didn't mention to her sister was her growing concern about other potential consequences of her newfound fame. The self-defense instructor had warned his students that using their skills in real situations could sometimes lead to legal complications, even when they were clearly in the right. There could be lawsuits from Marcus or his family, claiming excessive force. There could be copycat attempts by people who thought they could be heroes. And, now, apparently, there could be unwanted attention from dangerous people from her past. The knocking at her door had stopped, but when she looked out her window, she could see that the news vans were still parked outside. She realized she was effectively trapped in her own apartment until the reporters lost interest or found a bigger story to chase. Her phone rang again, this time showing Detective Park's number. "Ms. Martinez, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to give you an update on the case and ask you a few follow-up questions." "Of course, Detective. First, I want you to know that Marcus Thompson has been formally charged with armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and reckless discharge of a firearm. He'll likely be offered a plea deal given his lack of prior violent offenses and his obvious drug dependency issues." "What kind of plea deal?" "Probably 5 to 7 years with the possibility of parole if he successfully completes a drug treatment program. It could have been much worse if anyone had been seriously injured." Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this. Part of her was glad that Marcus would face consequences for his actions, but another part felt sorry for him. His life was essentially over. By the time he got out of prison, he would be in his 40s with a violent felony record and no realistic prospects for rebuilding his career. "There's something else I need to ask you about," Detective Park continued. "The gun that Mr. Thompson used was reported stolen 3 months ago in a burglary. We're trying to trace how it ended up in his possession. Do you have any idea how he might have obtained it?" Sarah thought about Marcus's appearance and behavior the night before. He didn't seem like someone who would know how to buy stolen weapons. He looked like he was new to this whole thing. "That matches our assessment. We think someone gave or sold him the gun, probably someone who knew about his financial problems and his desperation. We're looking into his associates, but any information you might have observed could be helpful." "I'm sorry, Detective. I didn't see him with anyone else, and he didn't mention working with other people. That's fine. I also wanted to warn you that there's been some media interest in your story. I know reporters have been trying to contact you, and I want you to be careful about what you say. This case isn't closed yet, and anything you say publicly could potentially affect the prosecution. After Detective Park hung up, Sarah tried to think about how to handle her situation. She couldn't stay in her apartment forever, but she also couldn't face the barrage of questions and cameras waiting outside. She decided to call in sick to work and try to wait out the immediate media frenzy. Around noon, her sister Lisa arrived with groceries and a plan. I parked 3 blocks away and came in through the back entrance, Lisa said, setting down 2 bags of food on Sarah's kitchen counter. The reporters are still out front, but they haven't figured out the back way yet. This is insane, Sarah said. Yesterday I was nobody. Today I can't leave my apartment without being chased by cameras. Welcome to your 15 minutes of fame, Lisa replied. The question is, what are you going to do with it? What do you mean? I've been watching the coverage all morning, and there's a lot of discussion about civilian self-defense and gun violence. Some people are calling you a hero and saying more people should learn to protect themselves. Others are saying what you did was reckless and dangerous. Either way, you've sparked a conversation. Sarah hadn't considered that her actions might have broader implications beyond her own situation and Marcus's prosecution. But as she thought about it, she realized that Lisa was right. The story had already become bigger than just a convenience store robbery. Her phone buzzed with another text from the number she didn't recognize. Don't ignore me, Sarah. We really do need to talk. This isn't about us. It's about your safety. Who keeps texting you? Lisa asked, noticing Sarah's expression. David. He says it's about my safety. Lisa's face darkened. Sarah, you need to call the police. If he's threatening you. I don't think he's threatening me. I think he's warning me about something. Sarah stared at the message, trying to read between the lines. David had always been cryptic, but she had learned to interpret his coded communications during their relationship. I think he's saying that my being in the news has attracted the wrong kind of attention. What kind of wrong attention? Sarah thought about David's mysterious business associates and the dangerous situations he had always seemed to be on the edge of. I don't know exactly, but David moved in some pretty dark circles. If people in those circles think I might be useful to them somehow, or if they think I might be a threat. She didn't finish the sentence, but Lisa understood. You think being known as someone who can disarm gunmen might make you a target? Or it might make people think I know things I don't actually know. David was always paranoid about what I might have overheard or seen during our relationship. If his associates think I'm getting public attention, they might worry about what I might say. Lisa sat down heavily on the couch. This is getting really complicated, isn't it? Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. Sarah Martinez? This is Captain Robert Hayes with the Metro Police Department. I understand you've been receiving some unwanted attention since last night's incident. Yes, sir. Reporters mostly. I'm not talking about reporters. We've received some intelligence suggesting that your involvement in stopping that robbery might have attracted attention from some criminal organizations in the area. I'd like to meet with you to discuss some precautionary measures. Sarah's blood ran cold. What kind of criminal organizations? I'd rather discuss this in person. Are you available to come to the station this afternoon? I can't leave my apartment. There are news crews outside. We can arrange to pick you up discreetly. Would 2 o'clock work? After confirming the time, Sarah hung up and looked at Lisa, who had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. This is really bad, isn't it? Lisa said. I think it might be. Sarah felt like her life was spinning out of control. 24 hours ago, her biggest worry had been finishing her quarterly reports. Now she was potentially being targeted by criminals and couldn't leave her apartment without being mobbed by reporters. At exactly 2 o'clock, 2 plainclothes detectives knocked on Sarah's back door and escorted her through a maze of side streets to an unmarked police car. They managed to avoid the media entirely, and Sarah found herself at the police station 15 minutes later, sitting across from Captain Hayes in a small conference room. Captain Hayes was a tall, gray-haired man in his 50s who looked like he had seen every possible variation of human behavior during his career. He spoke in a calm, measured tone that somehow made everything sound more serious. Ms. Martinez, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay confidential for your own safety and for the integrity of ongoing investigations. Can I have your word on that? Yes, of course. We've been monitoring communications between several known criminal organizations in the city, and Your name came up in at least 3 separate conversations in the last 12 hours. The context suggests that some people are very interested in your demonstrated skills and your potential usefulness to their operations. Sarah felt sick. What kind of usefulness? Some of these groups employ people to handle situations that require a certain level of physical capability. The fact that you successfully disarmed an armed individual suggests skills that could be valuable in their line of work. They may try to recruit you. And if I refuse? That's where it gets complicated. Some of these groups don't handle refusal well. And there's also the possibility that they might see you as a potential threat to their operations if you witnessed something during your previous relationship with David Reeves. Sarah's worst fears were being confirmed. So what am I supposed to do? In the short term, we recommend that you vary your routines, be aware of your surroundings, and consider staying with friends or family rather than at your own address. In the longer term, we may need to discuss more comprehensive protection options depending on how serious these threats become. This is unbelievable, Sarah said. I stopped a robbery. I did the right thing. And now my life is in danger because of it. I know it's not fair, Captain Hayes said sympathetically. But, unfortunately, doing the right thing sometimes has unexpected consequences. The good news is that we're aware of the situation and we're monitoring it closely. He handed her a business card with his direct number. I want you to call me immediately if anything unusual happens. Unusual could mean someone following you, strange phone calls, people asking questions about you in your neighborhood, anything that feels wrong. As the detectives drove her back to her apartment, Sarah tried to process the surreal turn her life had taken. She had always been a careful person, someone who avoided unnecessary risks and made sensible choices. But, in one moment of moral clarity, she had thrown caution aside and acted on pure instinct. Now she was discovering that heroic actions carried heroic consequences, and not all of those consequences were positive. When she arrived back at her building, she was relieved to see that most of the news vans had departed, probably chasing some newer story. But, as she walked up the back stairs to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her phone buzzed with another message from David. Meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone, and make sure you're not followed. This is important, Sarah. Trust me one more time. Sarah stared at the message, knowing that meeting with David was probably the last thing Captain Hayes would recommend. But she also knew that David, despite all his faults, had never lied to her about serious threats to her safety. If he was reaching out now, after 3 years of silence, it meant the danger was real and immediate. She had approximately 18 hours to decide whether to trust the ex-boyfriend who had once broken her heart, or to follow the advice of the police and try to stay safe by avoiding any contact with her dangerous past. Either choice could determine whether she lived or died, and she had no way of knowing which decision was the right one. As she locked her apartment door behind her and checked all the windows, Sarah realized that stopping the robbery had been the easy part. Everything that came after was going to test her in ways she couldn't have imagined, and she had no training manual for navigating the complex world of criminal politics and media attention that had suddenly become her reality. The young woman who had walked into Miller's convenience store had been brave and decisive. The woman who would emerge from this larger crisis would need to be something else entirely: smart, careful, and willing to make impossible choices with incomplete information. Sarah just hoped she was up to the challenge. Sarah spent the night pacing her apartment, weighing her options. Every rational thought told her to call Captain Hayes and report David's attempt to contact her. But something deeper, some instinct that had served her well in the convenience store, whispered that David might be her only real source of information about the threats she was facing. At 7 a.m., she made her decision. She would meet David, but she would do it on her terms. She called in sick to work again, citing stress from the robbery incident, which wasn't entirely untrue. Then, she spent 2 hours planning a route to Riverside Park that would let her detect if anyone was following her. Sarah left her apartment at 1:30 p.m., using the back exit and walking through a series of connected shopping centers and parking garages before taking 3 different buses to get within a half-mile of the park. She arrived early and positioned herself on a bench with clear sight lines in all directions, watching for any signs of surveillance. David appeared at exactly 3 p.m., approaching from the opposite direction she had expected. He looked older, thinner, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. But he still moved with the same careful awareness of his surroundings that she remembered from their relationship. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting down on the bench, but maintaining some distance between them. I know this is weird after everything. Just tell me what's going on, David. The police already warned me that some criminal groups might be interested in me because of what happened. David nodded grimly. The police know some of it, but not all of it. There are 3 different organizations that have taken notice of your little performance at that convenience store. 2 of them are just curious. They're always looking for people with useful skills. But the 3rd one is a problem. What kind of problem? The Kozlov Organization. Eastern European, based out of the Warehouse District. They handle high-end smuggling and money laundering, but they also do enforcement work for other groups. Very professional, very ruthless. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What do they want with me? It's not what they want with you directly. It's what they think you might know about me. David looked around the park nervously before continuing. I did some work for them a couple of years ago, before we broke up. Nothing violent, just some computer stuff, hacking security systems, creating false identities. But I saw more than they wanted me to see. What did you see? Details about their money laundering operation. Names, account numbers, methods they use to move cash. Enough to seriously damage their business if it ever came to light. Sarah began to understand the scope of her problem. And they think I might know these details too. They know we were together when I was working for them. They're paranoid by nature. And now that you're in the news demonstrating that you're not just some helpless civilian, they're wondering if you might be a threat. David, I never knew anything about your business. You made sure of that. I know, and you know, but they don't know. And they don't take chances with loose ends. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. So what are you suggesting? We have 2 options. Option 1. You disappear. New identity, new city, new life. I have contacts who can make that happen. Absolutely not. I'm not running away from my entire life because of something I didn't do. I figured you'd say that. Option 2. We give them what they want before they come looking for it. What do they want? David pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. Everything I know about their operation. Account numbers, shipping manifests, contact lists, everything. We give this to the FBI, the Kozlovs get arrested, and the threat to you disappears. Sarah stared at the tiny device. You've been carrying evidence of major crimes around for 3 years? Insurance policy. I always knew this day might come. David's expression was serious. But here's the thing. Once we do this, there's no going back. The Kozlovs will know it came from me, which means they'll know you were involved even if you weren't before. So either way, I'm in danger. Either way, you're in their world now. The question is whether you want to be a victim or a participant in ending the threat. Sarah stood up and walked a few steps away, trying to think clearly. Every option seemed to lead to more danger, more complications. But she remembered something her self-defense instructor had said. Sometimes the only way out of danger is through it. If we give this information to the FBI, what happens to you? I'll probably have to testify, which means witness protection after the trial. But that's better than being dead. And what happens to me? You'll probably have to testify too, since they'll try to establish that you knew about the information all along. But the FBI is good at protecting witnesses, and once the Kozlovs are in prison, the threat will be over. Sarah thought about her comfortable, predictable life, her job, her apartment, her routine. All of that would be gone if she agreed to David's plan. But if she didn't agree, she might lose something much more precious, her life. How do we contact the FBI? David smiled for the first time since he had sat down. I've already made some preliminary contacts. Agent Maria Santos with the Organized Crime Task Force. She's been investigating the Kozlovs for 2 years, and she's very interested in what we have to offer. You've already set this up? I've been planning for this possibility since the day I stopped working for them. I just never thought you'd get dragged into it. They walked to David's car, an old Honda that looked like it had seen better days. As he drove them across town to a federal building downtown, Sarah tried to prepare herself for what was coming. She was about to voluntarily enter the world of federal investigations, organized crime prosecutions, and witness protection programs. 6 months ago, the most dangerous thing in her life had been navigating office politics. Agent Santos was waiting for them in a conference room on the 14th floor. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Sarah's appearance and demeanor. Ms. Martinez, I understand you've had quite a few eventful days recently. That's one way to put it. Before we go any further, I need to make sure you understand what you're getting into. If you decide to cooperate with our investigation, your life is going to change dramatically. There will be months of interviews, document reviews, and preparation for trial testimony. During that time, you'll be under federal protection, which means restrictions on your movements and contacts. What about my job? You'll have to quit. We can help you relocate and establish a new career after the trial, but your current life in this city will essentially be over. Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. And if I don't cooperate? Then you go back to your apartment tonight, and we hope the local police can protect you from whatever the Kozlovs decide to do. But I have to tell you, our intelligence suggests they're planning to approach you within the next few days. Approach me how? Could be anything from a recruitment offer to a direct threat. These people don't waste time on subtlety once they've identified a potential problem. David leaned forward in his chair. Sarah, I know this isn't what you wanted, but if we don't do this, both of us are going to be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives. Agent Santos opened a thick folder and pulled out several photographs. These are surveillance photos of known Kozlov associates. I want you to look at them and tell me if you've seen any of these people in the last 2 days. Sarah examined each photo carefully. Most of the faces were unfamiliar, but one made her pause. A dark-haired man in his 30s with a scar across his left cheek. This one, I think I saw him yesterday morning when I was looking out my window. He was across the street, just standing there. Agent Santos and David exchanged glances. That's Viktor Petrov, Santos said. He's their surveillance specialist. If he was watching your apartment, it means they're already gathering information about your routine. So they're already making their move, David said grimly. Which means we need to move faster, Santos replied. Ms. Martinez, I need a decision now. We can have you in a safe house within 2 hours, or we can put you back on the street and hope for the best. Sarah thought about Marcus Thompson, sitting in a jail cell because he had made a series of bad choices under pressure. She thought about the convenience store clerk, Bill, who had just wanted to finish his shift and go home to his family. She thought about all the innocent people who might be hurt if the Kozlov organization continued operating without consequences. I'll do it, she said quietly. I'll cooperate with your investigation. Agent Santos nodded approvingly. Smart choice. David, we'll need you to walk us through the entire USB drive. Explain where each piece of information came from and how you obtained it. Sarah, we'll need a complete statement about your relationship with David and anything you might have observed during that time. I already told you, I didn't know anything about his business. Maybe not consciously, but you might remember conversations, visitors to his apartment, phone calls he received. Details that seemed unimportant at the time, but could help us build a stronger case. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah found herself recounting every detail she could remember from her relationship with David. Agent Santos and her colleagues asked about dates, times, locations, and people with a thoroughness that was both impressive and exhausting. Meanwhile, David was in another room going through the contents of the USB drive with a team of forensic accountants and computer specialists. The information he had collected was apparently even more comprehensive than he had initially described, containing not just financial records but also communications between Kozlov organization members and other criminal groups. This is a goldmine, Agent Santos told Sarah during a break in the interviews. If even half of this information checks out, we'll be able to take down not just the Kozlovs, but several related organizations. How long until the trial? Probably 12 to 18 months. We'll need time to verify all this information, build a comprehensive case, and coordinate with other agencies who might want to pursue related charges. Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. 18 months of hiding. 18 months of careful living. You won't be locked up. You'll have an apartment, a job, a social life. It just won't be your old apartment, your old job, or your old social life. As the sun set outside the federal building, Sarah signed papers that would transform her from a private citizen into a protected witness. She would be relocated to a city she had never visited, given a new identity, and assigned federal marshals who would be responsible for her safety. There's one more thing, Agent Santos said as they prepared to leave. The marshals will escort you back to your apartment tonight to collect some personal belongings, but you can only take what fits in 2 suitcases. Everything else, your furniture, your photos, your mementos, you'll have to leave behind. Sarah nodded, though the reality of losing all her possessions hadn't fully sunk in yet. What about my sister? Can I tell her what's happening? You can tell her that you're safe and that you'll be out of contact for a while. No details about the investigation or where you're going. The less she knows, the safer she'll be. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in her apartment for the last time, trying to decide which pieces of her old life were important enough to carry into her new one. She packed clothes, a few books, some jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, and a handful of photographs. Everything else, The furniture she had saved for months to buy, the decorations that made the place feel like home, the accumulated objects of 28 years of life, would remain behind like artifacts from a previous existence. As the federal marshals waited in the hallway, Sarah took one last look around the apartment where she had lived for 3 years. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a different city with a different name, and Sarah Martinez would effectively cease to exist. In her place would be someone new, someone whose primary purpose was to help bring down a criminal organization she had never willingly encountered. The woman who walked out of that apartment was not the same person who had stopped for gas at Miller's convenience store just 3 days earlier. That woman had been brave enough to disarm a desperate gunman. But this woman would need to be brave enough to disappear entirely and trust her life to strangers whose job it was to keep her alive long enough to testify. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage where an unmarked federal vehicle waited to take her away from everything she had ever known, Sarah wondered if she would ever again be able to live a simple, anonymous life. The convenience store robbery had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its consequences would reshape her existence for years to come. She was about to discover that being a hero was easy compared to being a witness, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was allow themselves to become invisible. 18 months later, Sarah walked into the federal courthouse in Denver using her new identity as Rebecca Walsh, a name that still felt foreign on her tongue despite months of practice. The woman who entered that building looked different from the one who had disappeared from her old life. Shorter hair dyed blonde, contact lenses instead of glasses, and a wardrobe that reflected the professional appearance the marshals had helped her cultivate for her new job as a paralegal. The trial of the Kozlov organization had finally begun, and Sarah was scheduled to testify the following day. Despite all the preparation, all the practice sessions with prosecutors, and all the security measures in place, she felt the same nervous energy she had experienced that night at Miller's convenience store. The difference was that this time, the stakes were even higher and the consequences even more far-reaching. Deputy Marshal Kevin Rodriguez had been her primary handler for most of her time in witness protection, and he sat beside her in the hallway outside the courtroom as they waited for the day's proceedings to end. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" he asked. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "I've been preparing for this for over a year, but actually sitting in that witness box with all those people staring at me." She shook her head. "Remember what we've practiced. Look at the prosecutor when she asks questions, speak clearly, and stick to the facts. Don't try to elaborate or explain things that are outside your direct knowledge." Through the courtroom doors, Sarah could hear the muffled voices of attorneys presenting their cases to the jury. David had testified 3 days earlier, spending 2 full days on the witness stand as prosecutors walked him through every piece of evidence on his USB drive. She had watched his testimony on closed-circuit television from a secure room, seeing how the months of preparation had transformed him into a different person as well. Calmer, more focused, but also carrying the weight of the choices he had made. The prosecution's case had been building methodically for 2 weeks. FBI agents had testified about their investigation, forensic accountants had explained the money laundering schemes, and other witnesses had provided context about the Kozlov organization's operations. Sarah's testimony would be one of the final pieces, establishing the timeline of David's relationship with the criminal organization and corroborating his claims about when and how he had obtained the incriminating information. "Ms. Walsh," a voice called from behind them. Sarah turned to see Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chin approaching, her arms full of legal files. "I wanted to go over your testimony one more time before tomorrow." They moved to a secure conference room where Chin spread out photographs, documents, and timeline charts across a large table. Sarah had seen all of this material dozens of times, but the prosecutor insisted on reviewing everything to ensure there would be no surprises during cross-examination. "The defense is going to try to paint you as someone who was deeply involved in Mr. Reeves' criminal activities," Chin explained. "They'll suggest that you helped him gather information about the Kozlov organization and that you're testifying now to save yourself from prosecution. But that's not true. I know it's not true, and the evidence shows it's not true. But they're going to try to create doubt in the jury's minds. The best way to counter that is to be completely honest about what you did and didn't know." Sarah nodded. She had learned during her months in protection that the legal system operated on different rules than the moral universe, where she had made her split-second decision to intervene in the convenience store robbery. In court, the truth was only as strong as your ability to prove it, and perception often mattered more than reality. "There's something else we need to discuss," Chin continued. Viktor Petrov, the man whose photograph you identified as having been outside your apartment, was arrested last week trying to enter the courthouse with a concealed weapon. He's being held without bail, but his arrest confirms that the Kozlov organization is still interested in disrupting this trial. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Even after 18 months of safety, the threat was still real and immediate. What does this mean for my security? Enhanced protocols starting tonight. You'll have an additional marshal assigned to your detail, and we're moving you to a different safe house until after your testimony is complete. That evening, Sarah packed her few belongings once again and was driven to a nondescript house in a suburban neighborhood 40 minutes from downtown Denver. The new safe house was smaller than her previous accommodations, but felt more secure, with reinforced windows and multiple escape routes that the marshals had mapped out in advance. She tried to eat dinner, but found that her appetite had vanished. Tomorrow, she would face the men who had turned her life upside down, and her words could determine whether they spent the rest of their lives in prison or walked free to continue their criminal operations. The responsibility felt overwhelming. Her phone, a secure device monitored by the marshals, rang just after 10 p.m. The caller ID showed Agent Santos's number. "Sarah, I wanted to call and wish you luck tomorrow. I know this hasn't been easy for you. Agent Santos, can I ask you something? Do you think we're going to win?" There was a pause before Santos answered. "I think we have a strong case, and I think you and David have provided us with the evidence we need. But juries are unpredictable, and these defendants have excellent lawyers. What happens if they're acquitted? Then, we've done everything we could with the evidence available. But, Sarah, regardless of what happens tomorrow, you've already won in the most important way." "What do you mean?" "You chose to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything. Not many people have that kind of courage." After hanging up, Sarah stood at the window of the safe house, looking out at the quiet suburban street. 18 months ago, she had been Sarah Martinez, accountant, living a predictable life in a familiar city. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a half-remembered dream. Rebecca Walsh, the identity she had inhabited for more than a year, was also temporary. After the trial, she would become someone else entirely, in another city, with another job, and another carefully constructed background. The marshals had explained that some witnesses adapted well to multiple identity changes, while others struggled with the psychological toll of never being able to fully be themselves. Sarah had discovered that she was adapting better than expected. The experience had taught her that identity was more fluid than she had ever imagined, that the essential core of who she was could survive even radical changes to her external circumstances. She was still the woman who had disarmed Marcus Thompson, still the person who chose action over safety when confronted with injustice. Those qualities transcended names and addresses. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn and went through the routine she had practiced dozens of times. Professional outfit, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a simple style that would look neat on camera. The marshals arrived at 7 a.m. to escort her to the courthouse, taking a different route than they had used the previous day. "Remember," Deputy Marshal Rodriguez said as they approached the building, "once you're in that courtroom, focus on the prosecutor and the judge. Don't look at the defendant's table unless you're specifically asked to identify someone." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she would be able to avoid looking at the men who had upended her life. She was curious to see what they looked like, these people who had become the central figures in her existence without her ever meeting them. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of the defendants. Sarah was led to a witness room where she waited until her name was called. She could hear the proceedings through a small speaker, the formal language of legal procedure that would determine the outcome of years of investigation and preparation. The government calls Rebecca Walsh to the stand. Sarah walked through the door into the courtroom, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She made her way to the witness stand without looking at anyone except the court clerk who administered her oath. Her voice was steady as she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen approached the witness stand with a reassuring smile. "Good morning, Ms. Walsh. Thank you for being here today. Can you please tell the court your occupation?" "I work as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates law firm. And, prior to your current position, what did you do for work?" "I was an accountant at Henderson & Company." For the next 3 hours, Chen walked Sarah through her relationship with David, their breakup, and the circumstances that had led to her involvement in the federal investigation. Sarah answered each question carefully, sticking to the facts and avoiding speculation about things she couldn't know for certain. When the prosecutor finished her direct examination, Sarah finally allowed herself to look at the defendant's table. The men sitting there looked surprisingly ordinary, middle-aged, well-dressed, the kind of people she might have passed on the street without a second thought. It was difficult to reconcile their mundane appearance with the elaborate criminal enterprise they had allegedly operated. The defense attorney who approached for cross-examination was a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s who moved with the confidence of someone who had dismantled many government witnesses before. Ms. Walsh, or should I say Ms. Martinez, the attorney began. You've been living under an assumed identity for over a year now, haven't you? Yes. And the government has been paying for your housing, your food, your medical care, and providing you with employment. Is that correct? The Witness Protection Program provides for basic needs, yes. So you have a significant financial incentive to provide testimony that supports the government's case, don't you? Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but she remembered Chin's coaching about staying calm under attack. I'm testifying because I want to tell the truth about what I observed. But if your testimony doesn't satisfy the prosecutors, you could find yourself back on the street, couldn't you? Back to being Sarah Martinez, the woman who interfered in a convenience store robbery and attracted the attention of my clients. I'm testifying truthfully regardless of the consequences. The cross-examination continued for another 2 hours, with the defense attorney attempting to portray Sarah as a willing participant in David's criminal activities who was now trying to save herself by implicating innocent businessmen. Sarah answered each question as directly as possible, neither volunteering additional information nor allowing herself to be trapped by leading questions. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, Sarah felt drained but also relieved. She had done what she came to do, had fulfilled her obligation to the legal system and to her own sense of justice. Whatever happened next would be determined by 12 jurors who would weigh her words against everything else they had heard during the trial. The trial concluded 4 days later with closing arguments that stretched over